It's taken a long time to write this video. I finished my playthrough of Lightning Returns in May? I then tabled it while the 2021-22 school year was winding down. I finished off my classes, I graded 3 different state exams, packed up my classroom to move it to a new building, and then I managed to teach 4 weeks of summer school. And now that I finally found myself in a position where it's time to write this script, I've found myself oddly estranged from the writing process.
What's wrong? Nothing, just things on my mind. Don't worry about it.
But a promise is a promise. So I suppose it's time to put down the excellent Xenoblade Chronicles 3, table my viewing of the J-drama Long Vacation, and talk about the excellent conclusion to the Final Fantasy XIII Trilogy, Lightning Returns, Final Fantasy XIII. Almost immediately following the conclusion of work on 13.2 and its related DLC material, Yoshinori Kitase's team, led by game director Motomo Toriyama, of course, set out to get cranking on one last Final Fantasy XIII game. The edict was set in stone that this game's development needed to be quick and dirty to ensure that players wouldn't forget all of the intricate details of 13.2's story content. The team also knew full well that this would be the last full Final Fantasy game to be developed solely for 7th generation consoles, so they hoped to depart from the generation with a swan song, celebrating everything they believed made the Final Fantasy XIII franchise such a success. From that starting point, the team began crafting a darker, more emotionally resonant ending to the 13 series. In a desire to make the world of Lightning Returns feel more open and alive, they took cues from huge 7th generation hits such as Skyrim and Dark Souls to make what they opted to call a world-driven game. That phrase comes up a lot in interviews. There's even some minor influence from developers who idolized Final Fantasy XI, though in what way I'm not totally certain after playing the game. All of this produced a large, luscious set of 4 distinct game zones, each one of which would be based on a different real-world locale. Each of these zones would be then developed by a different internal team, complete with a set of unique NPCs that operated on their own distinct schedules, and had its own distinct story quests and side quests to serve Lightning's mission in this final 13 game. There was a distinct attempt to allow Lightning to interact with everyone and everything around her, with the game being promoted as the most fully realized and substantial Final Fantasy title to date. In execution, it feels a little bit like Square Enix's take on the Shenmue world formula, though oddly that particular game never came up in any of the material that I dug through. Majora's Mask did, but only in the context that the team had little experience with it. Beyond the ambition of designing a fully fleshed out world-driven game, the team set out to make a game for more of the hardcore audience, implementing strict resource management via the inclusion of a timer that constantly runs during gameplay.
Yes, in 13 days God will reawaken. It'll all be over then.
Inspired loosely by the Doomsday Clock and the 2011 movie In Time, in which time is used as the world's currency, it allots you a maximum of 13 days, with each day lasting roughly a real-time hour or so. It's not nearly as nasty as it sounds. The team also sought to ditch the ATB combat of earlier 13 titles by implementing a brand new real-time combat system with shortened attack animations and an emphasis on responsiveness to player inputs that they referred to as WoW ATB. This new combat system relies on switching Lightning into different outfits during combat in order to exchange abilities you can execute with the controller's face buttons, and was allegedly not inspired by the outfit changing system of Toriyama's previous game, Final Fantasy X-2, but is apparently the full realization of the paradigm switching mechanic from earlier 13 games. The presence of the costume switching mechanic also limited combat to having one player in the party due to 7th generation console video memory limitations. The team also worked to improve movement abilities such as jumping and even climbing, though supposedly there's a whole lot more that they added that ended up being stripped out of the final game. In an IGN interview with game designer Yuji Abe, he claimed that there were hardcore elements that they had to strip out of the game, with elements like penalties for poor ratings in combat removed to make the game more palatable. Main development of the game was largely a streamlined and compartmentalized process. Lessons learned over nearly half a decade of constant work with the Crystal Engine toolset allowed for an efficient workflow that maximized the strengths of the engine to get exactly what they wanted out of it. The slowest part of the process came from the writing team, led by Daisuke Watanabe. Pitched as an attempt to bring Lightning back into the forefront after mostly being sidelined in 13.2, his team had the difficult task of not only writing a thoughtful expansion of and conclusion to the 13 story, but also had to fill the rest of the game world with a sense of life and purpose. Their work was slow and forced developers to constantly redesign world elements and cutscenes as it flowed nebulously. But as this would be the final entry in a storyline that had roots dating all the way back to 2005, it seems reasonable that, under the tight turnaround schedule, that pressure caused a bit of slowdown and stress on the writing team. Writing is hard. I've restarted this script like 4 times over the past 2 months. The game was officially revealed at the Final Fantasy 25th Anniversary celebration in 2012 during a 3-day event in Shibuya, commemorating the franchise with development materials and artwork covering the entire franchise on display. And it was released in time for the November 2013 holiday season in Japan and February 2014 in the West, roughly 2 years after its initial announcement, and just short of 3 years after the Japanese release of 13.2 in December of 2011. The press surrounding its release largely concerned itself with the inclusion of its 24-hour timer, the new combat system, the world-driven gameplay, and the team's attempt to create a more emotionally resonating story that served as a darker, more atmospheric conclusion to Lightning's quest, which Toriyama felt was at the heart of the 13 series. After completing my full playthrough, it stands tall as perhaps the most successfully emotionally fulfilling and, hear me out, fun to play of all of the Final Fantasy XIII games.
I bring you salvation! This is the last soul I'll save!
Lightning Returns owns. Set 500 years after the end of Final Fantasy XIII-2, in which Lightning finds herself encased in crystal, and essentially the world breaks after Noel and Sarah help kill God, Lightning is reawakened and unleashed upon a world that's essentially about to end. The prevailing god of the moment, Bunavelza, has deemed that the current reality is going to be destroyed in 13 days, and that Lightning will be it, or his, tool to determine who is going to survive said destruction and be brought to the new world. To help guide her, he's reawakened Hope Estime as a teenager again, to essentially be Lightning's eyes in the sky as she roams the remnants of society, acting out of a secret god-built base known only as the Ark, which is like a fancy minimalist hub where Hope sits and browses Twitter in his off hours. It's a weird vibe. As Hope so delicately explains, due to some god nonsense limitations, Lightning can only spend time amongst the people for a total of 24 hours before she has to come back to the Ark to, plug herself in to charge or whatever. During that time, you can ask Hope questions to help you debrief the events you lived through during the day, And also maybe get some fierce, but perhaps not always so helpful exposition.
In this world, all the clocks count to 12, but that wasn't always the case. Back in the old days, all clocks went to 13.
Hope also establishes that Lightning does not have the life force to survive all the way through to the 13th day, as Bunavelza has intended. She is responsible for saving souls during her time amongst the living by helping them wrap up their lives. Each soul she recovers contributes to a big life force donation that Lightning gives to Yggdrasil, the Tree of Life, when she returns to the Ark at the end of each day. If you do enough good for the surviving populace during the day, you're rewarded with additional time to bring even more salvation, though there's a hard 13-day cap. At the end of your possible 13 days, Bunavelza is gonna format the hard drive of reality and upgrade from Windows XP 2nd Edition to XP, thus breaking all backwards compatibility in one fell swoop. That's the general structure of the game. Drop down from a literal arc in an alternate reality and do your best to save as many people as possible. It's a subversion of some of Final Fantasy's most well-known tropes. You're no longer spending your time fighting against a specific known evil, and are instead working to save as many people as directly as possible. Unlike in 13 and 13.2, where you're actively fighting against the will of the gods, you're actually directly supporting their endeavors to allow them a smooth transition into this brand new reality. Once you leave the Ark and drop down into the remnants of the real world, you're greeted with a land that's been ravaged by the events of 13.2. Much of the world has been absorbed by ever-expanding chaos, and people have stopped aging. You can still die like normal people from violence or sickness, but you're stuck at whatever age you were at the end of 13.2, and have been exactly that age for the past 500 years. You get all the perks of eternal life without the actual immortality. You quickly learn that the habitable space has been restricted to 4 zones, and that it's your job to visit each of them to save as many of their inhabitants from destruction as possible. Each of the areas features one or more major story quests that bring you back into the fold with your old adventuring buddies from 13 and 13.2 in order to kind of bring them peace of mind after 500 years of stagnated life. These zones also have dozens of side quests that send you all over the remnants of the world to help different people wrap up their affairs. These side quests not only award you literal more time on Earth, but they also give you stat bonuses. It ends up playing out like a big emotional send-off to all of the characters that have ever been important to any of the plot events in the previous 2 games. In this sense, it feels like the closest I've ever been to a video game doing Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, where the band gets back together to solve one more world-ending crisis before retirement.
Hey! Did I miss the reunion? Old man, you're late again!
The first of the 4 zones that you're dropped into, Luxarian, is essentially a loose facsimile for the city of Paris. You find yourself wandering tight streets with busy markets and housing sprawling outwards in every direction. Before you have time to explore much, you discover that women bearing a striking resemblance to Lightning are being hunted down and murdered by a cult known as the Children of Etro, who I guess are doing so in order to prevent the potential return of the Savior. In parallel, Noel Kreis of 13.2 fame follows the trail of murders in the hopes that he'll find Lightning so that he can kill her and save his true love, the Cirrus Yule. This leads Lightning into direct conflict with Noel, forcing them to clash in epic style. In being defeated, Lightning helps him refocus his rage and helps him realize that he's become blinded by it in the 500 years since 13.2's conclusion, which led him to fall prey to a false prophecy that allowed him to create his own false hope for a better future. Beyond the introductory main quest, Many of Luxarian's side quests and activities are geared towards familiarizing yourself with the structure of the game. Its quests teach you about waiting for certain people to return to their stores or homes at appropriate times, about how intensively the game is going to require you to search your surroundings for material, and how item shops, inns, and restaurants work as gameplay elements. Luxarian is the tutorial city, and it's the best place to start for those who have never engaged with this game before. I spent the first 2 days of my playthrough here in Luxarian, resolving the zone's story quest in short order, and then spending the rest of my 2 days just sort of hanging out doing chores of all different sorts for the variety of people in its various districts to help me better understand the kind of tasks Lightning Returns would be expecting me to do. It paints an interesting first impression for those visiting the remnants of the world for the first time. These people have lived ageless lives for 500 years. They're trapped in these hopeless routines, and many of them have begun to forget who they were over the course of their long lives. Children are stuck in the bodies of children for all eternity. The elderly remain in their decrepit state. Some find solace in the quaint structures of capitalism that still remain, while others wander in hopes that someone can help them solve the problems that have bested them for half a millennium. These 2 days gave me vibes that were reminiscent of Lost Odyssey in that they were dripping in sadness caused by immortality. We as humans live such short lives that it would be impossible to truly predict what it would be like if we lived to be even 100 or 200, let alone 500 years old. Most of us won't even cross that barrier to 100. It's fascinating to me that Daisuke Watanabe and his writing team, the then current Final Fantasy New Guard, reached a similar conclusion to that of Hironobu Sakaguchi and his writing team, in that both these games depict ageless lives as full of pain, so much so that we begin to forget who we were entirely as time marches onwards. I suppose it doesn't take much research to determine that basically every culture's depiction of immortality aligns with theirs, but it's amusing that the original Final Fantasy and the continuing Final Fantasy present stories with such similar findings. Lightning Returns examines it at a societal level, while Lost Odyssey takes a more personal approach to the problem. Both are equally interesting, however. The second leg of my journey brought me by way of scheduled train to the bombastic city of Yusnan, which once thrived under the leadership of Snow, famed meathead and fiancé of Lightning's sister, Sarah. After 500 years of leadership, he's become jaded and distant. The city aimlessly lumbers towards a series of celebrations held to welcome the end of the world as Snow plots an end to his long, meaningless life. After 500 years, he's determined that he'll never be able to save and spend his life with Sarah, who disappeared after the events of 13-2, and decides to plunge himself into a supply of chaos in order to tempt Lightning into ending his life. This forces Lightning to develop a plan with Hope to infiltrate his castle, which drags her all over the Vegas-inspired landscapes of Yusnan in order to find a way to get in without earning his attention. In the process, I had to do extravagant things such as collecting fireworks, perform in a stage play, and tackle a number of side quests that had me doing everything from checking posters for women's phone numbers and developing a refined taste for Yusnan cuisine in order to reunite an estranged father and son. In some ways, the trip to Yusnan feels like an extension of your time in Luxarian in that they're both sprawling cities full of people scrambling to find meaning in their lives after all of this time. Some seek to lose themselves in fine cuisine, and others lose themselves in the seemingly never-ending festivities held within the city walls. Others seek glory in the city's combat arena, where Lightning herself can participate to acquire items and even later a story quest item that's essential to completing the game. Yusnan is a genuinely interesting, vibrant place to spend time in, much like Luxarian. They're both very fleshed out spaces that feel lived in, more so than anything in 13 or 13-2. As much as I enjoyed the story content that was nestled into each of these zones, I just generally enjoyed hanging out in these spaces as well. They feel like excellent examples of the world-driven concept that developers hyped up in pre-release interviews, where things happen around you at all times without your input. Unlike in traditional open-world games, you're simply a visitor in these zones. The world doesn't revolve around you, much like it didn't in previous simulation-type games like Shenmue and Shenmue 2 on the Dreamcast. People don't wait around for you simply because you're the player. For instance, you might visit a stall in Yusnan where a man asks you to return the next day at noon. He acknowledges that you're an important individual, but he's very clear on when you need to return. Me, being the busybody that I am, forgot to return the next day. Instead, I waited several days to return, and when I did, the man was irritated, refused to deal with me, and failed me out of a high-level side quest as a result. To me, that's the spirit of the world-driven concept. True story, you can just visit the inn and sleep away most or all of the days you're allotted in Lightning Returns. In doing so, you miss out on all sorts of opportunities to participate in side quests, and your lackadaisical attitude straight up causes the game difficulty to increase as if to taunt you for refusing to engage with it as it lives its own life without you. To me, that's the world-driven idea, and it's very much embodied in these first two cities. After spending several days wandering the streets of Yusnan in search of side quests and stat boosts, I took a train out to the Wildlands where I was free to explore the last stretches of Grand Pulse that weren't absorbed by the chaos. It was here that the main story quest led me on a hunt for a mythical white chocobo. After spending much time submerged with the locals, growing Gaisal greens and completing side quests, I was able to track down and then nurse back to health this mythical white chocobo. It's like a regular chocobo, except that it can jump higher and is actually a physical manifestation of Lightning's Eidolon from Final Fantasy XIII. They really did bring back every character. This, of course, was solely to allow me to access the main story quest for the Wildlands, which brought me back into the lair of 13-2's resident bad guy, Caius Ballad. And the place where he's chosen to stake his ground? The ruins of Valhalla. That place from the beginning of 13-2. These are the weirdest callbacks in the game. It's very amusing that the weakest callbacks occur in what I might characterize as the biggest, blandest area of the game. The Wildlands feel like the place that need your presence the least. Unlike Luxarian and Yusnan, that were bustling metropolises full of stagnated lives, the people who have settled the Wildlands are largely research scientists and those who feel more at home with the Earth. It lends the tasks you complete in this zone an air of routineness. These people aren't desperate for Lightning's help, but they sure are willing to take advantage of her presence to accomplish their goals a little bit easier. Anyways, it turns out that Caius is trapped in a perpetual cycle of non-death due to the continuous rebirth of the seeress Yule, who desires his presence to watch after her. And also, I guess, Yule is directly responsible for the chaos? Sure. Why not? Lightning tries to save him, and he declares that he and Yule are beyond saving, and therefore must perish with the chaos as the world is destroyed. It's sort of a fitting end for a man fixated so heavily on committing atrocities in 13-2 to save Yule, that he ends up taking one for the team in this dark, weird, defeated sort of way. This main quest is by far the longest winded and the most difficult. The fight with Caius is perhaps the most complex and outright challenging sequence I completed in my normal playthrough of the game. Beyond that, the Wildlands is also by far the least interesting of the environments to traverse in the game. It's a vast space largely populated by monsters, with small pockets of people spread out all over it. It's the only open environment in the game that you can't easily walk across, and the only one where it feels like the game's resource-intensive fast travel is the best way to traverse it after like 8 full laps across its open plains. Exploring Graham Pulse's environments in the 13 games has always been a bit of a chore. It's disappointing that they couldn't quite figure out a way to fix this with the final entry in the series. The final zone I visited during my extended work trip, that's the joke that I'm sticking with, was the Dead Dunes. It's very self-explanatory. This is the desert zone. Here, civilization has reformed itself around excavating ancient ruins left behind by a long-lost group of people who secured an item known as the Holy Clavis deep within its monster-infested hallways and rooms. Interestingly enough, the further we appear to get by train from cities like Luxarian and Euston, the more hardy the people are, which makes the vibe feel very different to chill with. Some dude in the desert literally asks you to murder every monster on the planet, and there's really only one small town to operate out of. That town feels more like a resort town with a few shops, a bar, and a small place to stay the night. It's here that your main quest collides you head-on with Fang, everyone's favorite spicy Australian lassie from Final Fantasy XIII. Turns out that she and Vanille were freed from their crystals sometime before Lightning returned. It turns out that Vanille has found herself wrapped up in a religious cult that wants to use her to collect and then purify the souls of the dead. Fang, realizing that the cult wishes to destroy Vanille in the process, has taken to the ruins underneath the dunes to race the cultists for the Holy Clavis, which can then be used to save her from that particular fate. Conveniently, Lightning has some special god powers that allow her to access places Fang couldn't, and so the two form an adventuring party to dig into the depths of the ruins to find the Holy Clavis. The Dead Dunes rock because you get to pal around with your bud from Final Fantasy XIII, something none of the other zones give you a chance to do, unless you count rolling with the white chocobo as your Eidolon bud from 13, although you were not really friends with the Eidolons. You don't really have character relationships with them. It's not the same. It feels like old times again, especially since the ruins are a massive dungeon full of long-winded door puzzles and simple mechanics that harken back to the Final Fantasy dungeons of days long gone. It's an all-killer, no-filler kind of zone, pitched in-game as an area full of the hardest monsters in the game. On that promise, it delivers. By the time I reached the Dead Dunes, I had thoroughly combed the previous 3 zones over the course of the first 6 days as the world's savior. I had a firm grasp of the game's combat mechanics, and I was thirsting for more. You do end up finding the Holy Clavis, but due to shenanigans, the evil cult ends up absconding with it anyways. Frustrated, Fang dumps you and goes off to find a new way to save Vanille from her unpleasant fate. You know what they say, you can't have a jetpack and a cool uncle, I guess. Left to your own devices, you'll find that the Dead Dunes is pretty sparse on side quests, with many of them asking you to kill off difficult monsters or tackle optional bosses that I didn't find quite as enjoyable as the search for the Holy Clavis. You also receive the aforementioned side quest here that tasks you with killing every single monster in the game. Basically a request that asks you to commit genocide on a massive scale towards every monster by killing as many of them as possible until you fight the last one, which is like an alpha version. It's a bit of a wild side quest that feels emblematic of the vibe of the Dead Dunes. Kill or be killed to make it out here in the desert. It's the least hangoutable of all the game's zones, which feels appropriate for a toasted wasteland. You start to feel the game beginning to wrap itself up as you comb through the wastes of the desert. After completing the main quest in the Dead Dunes, I found myself with one main quest left. You see, in the process of exploring the wildlands, you run into your old pal Saz. You know, my main man. Turns out, at some point, his son Daz's soul was stolen from his body. Conveniently, Chocolina, returning from 13-2, who continues to irritate you every time you access the game's bounty board, knows where all 5 of the pieces are, and sends you on an extravagant quest across all 4 of the game's zones to retrieve pieces of his soul. This final quest, separate from its own distinct chunk of the world, essentially is a fetch quest on a grand scale, and is the only main story quest that truly feels boring. In a game full of dozens of side quests that could be easily qualified as bland, suddenly making a main story quest out of the bland stuff ended up like breaking my brain. It was like the illusion of hangoutness was finally shattered. I did not enjoy this quest. It didn't take me too long to do all of this. I was able to complete all 5 of the game's main story quests within the first 7 in-game days. If you wait to finish them after that amount of time, the difficulty of the boss fights increases, and I frankly was not about to put up with that kind of foolishness. At this point, you're given 2 choices. You can spend the last 6 days hanging out and grinding out side quests, or you can head over to an inn to sleep out the last 6 days of the world. I chose the hangout option, which means that the last half of my time in Lightning Returns was spent wandering through the now structureless game zones. These next 6 or so days of my playthrough highlighted something that I haven't touched much upon. The game's timer system doesn't really matter. In early tester playthroughs of Lightning Returns, the restrictions on increasing time and penalties you could be subjected to that cost you time were so aggressive that most playtesters couldn't finish the game. In retooling it, they made a game that was so much more generous in terms of how much time you have to complete its main quests that you can spend 20 hours of game time just chillin' and still manage to finish the entirety of the game's story in roughly 10 or so hours of gameplay. I spent the last 6 days of my playthrough scrounging for content. I scraped the bottom of the barrel for every side quest and activity that I could get to build my stats for the endgame. I spent hours of my day hunting bigger and bigger enemies to extinction so that I could harvest the items that they dropped to help me prepare. It became a hangout game in the truest sense. There are hours of footage in my library of me just wandering around, chilling in the game world doing side quests, taking care of sub-side quest activities, and fine-tuning equipment layouts. That you can just do that for such a long portion of the game's time is so good. This is where I truly fell in love. Not so much with the returning characters or the gripping, highly emotional storytelling, but with just playing the game. Lightning Returns is a really engaging Japanese role-playing game with complex mechanics that reward you over and over for a willingness to engage with all that it has to offer. Sometime around day 11, Sid Raines, barely notable bad dude from Final Fantasy XIII, visits you and is like, "Hey man, Bunavelza is actually a huge jerk who's been manipulating you from the start into helping him erase the memories of all the souls who will pass on into his new world through sacrificing Vanille. At this point, the plot shifts back into the regular Final Fantasy kind of style with a new objective to prepare to kill God. You've spent the entirety of the game doing all of this presumably good stuff for humanity's future, only to learn that you're just sort of helping perpetuate the same cycle in a new setting. This, of course, doesn't sit well with Lightning, who takes it upon herself to, in true Final Fantasy XIII fashion, defy her assigned fate and head in a new, god-killing direction. It's a late game twist that doesn't particularly strike me as an interesting one for the franchise, but it does feel like the cozier road to take. It would have been a massive subversion for Lightning to follow orders and be wholly complicit in the plans of a god, and I'm not totally sure that the 13 writing staff would have been able to pull it off with any really interesting subtlety and whatnot. From here, the momentum of the story doesn't necessarily change, as you still have 2 full days to kill before the world ends. But it sure does feel different now that you're charging towards a massive fight to the finish with Bunavelza, whereas previously Lightning was only working towards the basic goal of maximized human salvation. I should note that there's an additional character named Lumina who sort of looks like Sarah a little bit, like a child like Sarah. She spends a lot of the game popping in and taunting Lightning as she continues to move through her quest for salvation. She's a little playful and a little silly, but that's because her presence doesn't really get explained until the very end of the game. Before that, she's just sort of a bit of a nuisance. It's a weird call, but I'm rolling with it. At the end of the 13th day, you're automatically transported to the temple where Vanille is expected to carry out the ritual in which she releases the souls of the dead, inadvertently wiping their memories in the process. Lightning fights her way through to Vanille and talks her into not saving them and instead releasing them to be free. This, of course, angers Bunavelza, causing him to show up and personally lay on the smackdown. He explains that he's been grooming her to become the next goddess Etro. You know, the goddess that you destroy, or that gets destroyed at the end of 13-2, causing all of this nonsense. Like usual, Lightning rejects this future for herself and engages Bunavelza in direct combat. She wounds him and attempts to shove him out of the new reality that's being formed as they fight. Lightning learns that Lumina is actually a manifestation of her vulnerabilities that she'd previously rejected in her life. And she embraces Lumina, and together they call out to the entire expanded cast of characters to sever the bonds that Bunavelza has on humanity, freeing them at last from the grips of the gods as they enter this new world. Beautiful. Just beautiful. The 13 trilogy ends in a bombastic explosion of fan service that left me feeling all warm and fuzzy. Lightning's journey comes to an end in such a way that embraces her strong friendships that now span half a millennium, reforged through her willingness to help them climb out of the darkness that nearly swallowed them all. Somehow, Lightning Returns manages to pull off something that many long-winded trilogies of games usually miss: a satisfying conclusion. Over the course of 13 days, Lightning returns to find her closest friends nearly swallowed up by encroaching darkness, and uses the power she's been bestowed with to bring them back from the brink. In parallel, through a never-ending string of good deeds, Lightning manages to reconnect with her own humanity by saving its remaining members from destruction. She becomes whole again, and in doing so leads humanity into the new world to start fresh, something she's never truly been able to do herself. As credits roll, she's finally free of responsibility. She no longer has any obligation to anyone but herself. Her burden, and also the burdens of those she loves, has been lifted. It's a remarkably straightforward ending to a series that nearly twisted itself out of control with a second entry that emphasized gameplay over storytelling verisimilitude, and a first entry that never really necessitated a franchise's worth of follow-ups to begin with. It's also a fascinating exploration of the use of time in a video game. Lightning is given a small number of 24-hour days to save as many people as possible from the end of the world. From the moment the game starts, you're given a limited time to interact with the world, but also nearly instantly given the terms through which you can extend your stay. You must bring peace to these timeless people in order to extend your own time, and in doing so, finally end their lingering existence so that you can find your own. It's an interesting way to force players to engage with side quests. It draws you closer to the world you're inhabiting by forcing you to interact with as many people as possible, to learn their stories, to feel some of their pain, and bring them peace after 500 years. It's a genius way to coerce players into engaging with more of the game as opposed to rushing through it, and in the process of extending your own time, discover just how long and rich those 13 days can ultimately become. Rushing through the story content in Lightning Returns isn't just not recommended, but largely impractical due to the stat bonuses that side quests grant you. You must dedicate some of your limited time to the people. It's an interesting cycle of events. At the beginning, you feel the stress of time running out and want to rush, but in the process, you organically extend time so that you can finish the mission you've been assigned in a comfortable manner. After a certain point, you extend time so far off into the future that the stress of the timer dissipates entirely, or at least it did for me. It's also unique in that it has a defined endpoint. You cannot extend past 13 days. It will end whether you are ready for it or not, in the truest execution of the world-driven style. Many JRPGs sprawl nebulously as you move through them. This final entry in the 13 Trilogy very proudly defines its limits and its endpoint from the start. The world is ending and there's nothing you can do but scramble to be as productive as possible in your limited time, much as the development team was given a short timeline to complete this game and bring this saga to a close. It's one of the few games I've played that makes the player aware constantly of its ending in this way, which makes it feel like a distinct and confident third act to the story. It's truly remarkable coming from the same team that wrote 13-2's scenario. But, as great as its narrative, quest design, and overall game structure are, where Lightning Returns truly shines is in its core gameplay. In terms of raw gameplay, Lightning Returns was designed to accomplish two things. One, create a faster, more fluid version of Lightning for players to control, and two, bring back some of the players that walked away from the franchise after the release of 13 and 13-2 with a fresh approach to the Final Fantasy XIII battle system. In terms of creating a more fluid version of Lightning, the team was largely successful. Lightning can now sprint, jump, and draw her blade in the overworld to preemptively initiate combat. You get the sense while moving her through the game world that if they'd been working with a more powerful platform that wasn't limited by disk access speeds and limited video memory, that Lightning Returns could have been even more of an action game, with Lightning initiating combat in the overworld in the way that games like Xenoblade Chronicles or Kingdom Hearts does their thing. I can see this version of the game in my head running on the Series X in 4K at 60 frames per second, and it's a pretty remarkable experience. When it comes to raw combat, though, Lightning Returns truly brings the thunder. The new WoW ATB system is the pinnacle of action RPG combat. After 2 games of refining out the need for individual player inputs in the 13 series, the combat designers, who previously worked on the 2 titles and games such as Kingdom Hearts 2 and The Way of the Samurai games, and would later go on to help shape the Final Fantasy VII Remake combat, decided to veer into the complete opposite side of the road with a battle system designed to constantly have you inputting commands at all times. The premise for combat is simple. Lightning brings 3 outfits into combat with her, and each one of these outfits has 4 distinct commands such as attacks, guards, or magic like fire and blizzard, and each one has its own stamina bar, referred to in-game as an ATB bar, that has its own unique length and recharge rate. The more advanced a technique you have attached to your outfit, the more of that ATB bar it consumes to execute. You can rapidly switch between outfits with a simple tap of the shoulder buttons, with the main goal being to maximize the execution of your abilities in each outfit to then stagger and defeat your enemies. For those who don't remember, the stagger bar is a meter that fills when you attack an enemy with magic attacks, preferably those that it's weak against, but drains quickly unless you balance these magic attacks with physical attacks to keep the bar from draining. It makes its comeback in Lightning Returns, and in some ways is more important than ever. Building effective stagger is key to most, if not all, of the major boss encounters in the game. A frantic button masher, this game is most certainly not. New to this game is the ability to parry attacks with a well-timed guard move, which quickly becomes crucial to surviving many of the game's elaborate combat encounters. I hate this. I have never been good at parrying in any game. Please, stop making me do this. Developers described this new combat system as the fullest realization of the paradigm system from the previous 2 games, in which you had your party members switch roles to maximize their effectiveness in combat. I'm assuming that what they meant by this is that Lightning not only switches roles when she moves from outfit to outfit, but that she literally does a quick change in the middle of the combat. It's by far the most in-your-face indication of role switching. Its only equal elsewhere in the franchise is in Toriyama's first major game as director, Final Fantasy X-2, though in some interviews it was stressed that this mechanic was not inspired by the dress spheres of X-2, which I'm not totally sure that I believe. Equally as important as the choices you make in terms of individual actions that you equip each outfit with is the items that you attach to each of the outfits. Each outfit has a specific base set of stats, and some of them have locked-in abilities, and then they also have equipment that you have to pair with it. You have to pick a shield, as well as an accessory, and a ring with each of your outfits in order to maximize what you can do with the outfit. In this sense, the choices that you make determine the paradigm that you bring in with you to battle. It feels like a lot to pile on during your first playthrough, but by the time that you're ready to rush into the endgame, it often feels like second nature building these outfits. It's as intuitive as it is comically dense, especially since there's dozens of outfits, shields, and accessories to choose from. You can build an outfit with a high-level guarding ability and recovery actions to act as a tank of sorts. And then pair that outfit with 2 magic-oriented outfits to help maximize your damage output, or build outfits that maximize physical damage and high health. It really boils down to what you know about the enemy you're about to face, and how effective you want your approach to be in combat. Because enemies don't directly provide experience points in this game to boost your stats, the combat ratings aren't nearly as important as they were in previous 13 games, allowing for maximized flexibility and grace in your approach to enemy defeat. What enemies in traditional combat encounters are good for, however, is providing you with expendable resources that you're going to use throughout the game. Participating in combat nets Lightning EP, which can then be used outside of combat to trigger chronostasis, which allows you to stop the 24-hour timer for a short period of time, and in combat to execute special moves, cast Curaga and Hisuna, and trigger Overdrive, which allows you to execute commands as quickly as possible during the limited time that it is active without any ATB gauge to limit what you can accomplish. You start the day with your EP maxed out based on wherever you are in the story, which then drains as you need it, motivating you to engage in combat in order to retrieve more of it. The more difficult the enemy, the more EP you receive from defeating it. You also receive gil and crafting items and abilities from each encounter, which you'll then funnel into purchasing new gear, completing side quests, and synthesizing new abilities. The game features a fully fleshed out ability synthesis mechanic which allows you to upgrade abilities by spending gil and combining existing abilities with other abilities that you collect from treasure spheres and enemies. You can spend hours piecing together a set of abilities with maximized capabilities through grinding and scouring the game world to fit exactly what you want. It's quite luxurious. That's what playing this game is. Luxurious. It's a succulent dance of timed and carefully calculated button presses and meticulous curation of equipments and items. I haven't even mentioned the application of traditional items such as potions and ethers. Lightning can only bring a certain number of each into battle and basically possesses no recovery abilities of her own beyond medic guardings. This adds another layer of planning on top of organizing everything that's already been discussed. Success is an intricate puzzle that asks you to engage with all of the game's mechanics. There's no room to leave anything on the table, no matter how flexible you want to be in your approach. Take, for instance, the battle in which you face off with Caius. A successful run of this boss battle demands that you have 3 distinct outfits that allow you to debuff Caius's magical and physical attack stats, provide yourself with a sufficient number of guard techniques across all 3 outfits, and also a selection of magic and physical attacks that allow you to balance your ATB stamina and your ability to build and maintain a stagger bar. These outfits also need to have enough HP and defensive stats to ensure that Caius's attacks don't kill you instantly if he drops his signature attack, the Mega Flare. He deals an incredibly high amount of damage even with your guard up, so you need to bring a selection of items that ensures that you can heal yourself at regular intervals, and you need to sufficiently grind out enough EP that you can take advantage of overdrive when his stagger has been triggered to deal sufficient damage during those damage rounds. As with all good boss battles in action games, eventually he keeps wearing you down to the point where his Mega Flare attacks will instantly knock you down. The only way to sidestep this is to use the game's parry mechanic while guarding to ensure that you do not meet your own demise. You also need to ensure that you've completed enough side quests in order to ensure that your base stats are high enough to defeat him quickly. Your outfits don't have enough raw stats on their own, and a longer in fight ensures that he will eventually keep mega flaring you to the ground. You simply cannot skimp on any of the game's interlocking mechanics to find success in this main quest boss battle. It's remarkable in that it asks so much of the player, yet never really pushes you to burnout due to its largely player-driven pacing and structure. There's so much to do and so much to keep track of, but you can do it in any order you choose at any pace, which allows you to figure things out as slowly as you need to. And many players will need a lot of time to grow into the game's dense combat mechanics. I sure as heck did. There's a lot of trust in the player to play this game how they feel fit, which is not something that any previous Final Fantasy XIII titles have ever done. There are still sequences like the battle with Caius that test your comprehension of the systems and skills, but how you develop those skills is largely up to you. Gone are the days of 13 where every player needed to have the exact same experience. Lightning Returns combat is Burger King. You can have it your way, and you can have it now. It's brilliant. It shines in such a way that I can readily admit that it is the most fun I have ever had just chilling with a Final Fantasy game. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII carries a lot of weight on its shoulders. It's the conclusion to a trilogy. It's the last 7th generation mainline Final Fantasy. It brings closure to a series of games that began a shift in the conversation regarding Final Fantasy's legacy as a brand. Shoot, It's the last wholly original game that Yoshinori Kitase's production team would produce before throwing themselves back into the Final Fantasy VII ring, where they remain to this day. And also their last game to utilize the Crystal Tools engine to show what the engine was capable of. It was also a deliberate attempt to design a more hardcore game to bring back players that had left the brand after recognizing internally that Final Fantasy XIII had soured the pot with its attempt to streamline some of the most distinct qualities that Final Fantasy had become known for. So how does it hold up in that position? I've already offered up lavish praise for the game's storytelling chops. It's a surprisingly emotional conclusion to a franchise through a leading character that previously could have been described as cold and distant at best by mainstream press and online discussion of the era. They managed to bring the Final Fantasy XIII plane down with an elegant, spectacular landing after 13.2 sorta sends it into a nosedive with its wild ending and its DLC material. And all of this came out of a 2-year development window. They toss out nearly every convention of the 13 franchise, and manage to make it still feel like a labor of love to the 13 titles that preceded it. It's an incredibly rewarding game for longtime fans of the 13 characters, and also for those who love system-rich, action-heavy JRPGs. As a piece of technical software, it pushes the Crystal Tools engine to its very limits, delivering vast landscapes with minimal loading time, spectacle-heavy combat animations, and excellent sound design without pushing the 7th generation consoles too far over their own limits. As an attempt to rebrand the game and welcome back hardcore fans by distancing it from Final Fantasy XIII, it's an overall failure. Full enjoyment of this game is tied too intrinsically to buying into all of the characters that 13 and 13.2 introduce and their interweaving story arcs. If you don't love the characters of the 13 trilogy, I'm not totally sure that this game will resonate with you nearly as much, or even at all. As far as contemporary critical reception goes, the game received the lowest scores of the trilogy, with many reviewers citing the less than impressive graphics and issues with the storytelling. In a review by Kevin Van Ord for GameSpot, he cites the timer mechanism as anti-exploration, anti-experimentation, and anti-story. He condemns the storytelling as one-dimensional, and writes off Lightning as a character devoid of any warmth to connect to, and friend stories just as shallow. He also slams the audio production as being obnoxious and repetitive. In praising the combat, he notes the inclusion of the block mechanic as a greatly irritating one. Many of the negative critical reviews of Lightning Returns felt the clock strangled the game, and though I disagreed due to my own experiences with the game, I suspect many players will agree with these critics' sentiments due to the added pressure that a timer tends to add to anything. Like every Final Fantasy XIII game before it, it's a divisive one. Upon its release in Japan in November of 2013, Lightning Returns debuted to the lowest sales of all 3 of the 13 franchise titles. It sold a measly 277,000 copies during its first week on sale, facing competition from Super Mario 3D World, which also reportedly undersold for the Wii U, and the continued success of handheld games such as One Piece Unlimited World Red and the then new Pokemon X and Y. It's important to remember that the world Lightning Returns debuted into was the world where mainstream gaming outlets were supposing the end of the home console, where the handheld and mobile platforms were dominating sales charts and engagement, especially in Japan. It tracks that the sales of the home console game Lightning Returns were quite low then compared to the previous 2 games that released in 2009 and 2011 respectively, when home console engagement was more healthy. Sales reports from the month of its release in the United States, February of 2014, had its combined Xbox 360 and PS3 sales coming in at a lackluster 8th of 10 places in the NPD sales reports. It faced fierce competition from not just console titles such as Call of Duty Ghosts, the Lego Movie video game, and NBA 2K14, but also from the release of the 8th generation consoles such as the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. By 2017, the title had reportedly sold about 1.5 million copies across all platforms worldwide, and according to interviews given in the time after its release, had generally met sales expectations set for it by Square Enix. Of those 1.5 million, only 270,000 of them were sold for the Xbox 360 according to VG charts, with only 10,000 reported copies sold in Japan for the platform. As a piece of the Xbox 360's legacy, Lightning Returns is perhaps a representation of the Xbox 360's massive failure as a platform to break new ground for Microsoft in Japan and redefine its image as a new place to feast on Japanese games. It moves hand in hand with the end of the 7th generation's long-term viability. Against massive multi-platform releases across both the 7th and 8th generation consoles, Lightning Returns was likely always going to have greatly limited sales potential in the West. It's safe to conclude that with both of its sequels selling dramatically smaller amounts than the last title, that Final Fantasy XIII's brand is a bit of a tarnished one. Unlike the expansion of the Final Fantasy VII universe, or 10 before it, Final Fantasy XIII didn't resonate with many fans of the franchise, which led to general disinterest in its follow-ups. Sure, it met sales expectations for its publisher, but the team that made these games was the Final Fantasy Old Guard. It's no wonder that their next project, the Final Fantasy VII Remake series, would be a reimagining of an already beloved entry in the franchise. If you tried really hard to craft something new over and over again to bring fans around and ultimately failed, wouldn't you stick to what already is guaranteed to work? Today, much like with 13 and 13.2 before it, the Xbox is the only console platform where you can play Lightning Returns in its full glory. It received a bump up to 4K resolution when it was added to the backwards compatibility program for those who owned an Xbox One X console, and also received a 60 FPS speed boost on the Xbox Series platforms, which is where I recorded all of the footage for all 3 of these 13 game videos. It's a lasting reminder of what Microsoft attempted to do with the 360, and although these games alone failed to break the Xbox in as safe for Japanese gamers, it was nice to see the biggest Japanese role-playing game publisher in the world support Microsoft in their endeavor to make Xbox a worldwide brand. A trend that Microsoft continues to push for when it does things like announces Yakuza 7 as a timed exclusive for the Xbox Series consoles, or modern console ports of Persona titles in its Xbox showcases. You keep on trying, Mr. Spencer. Someday, maybe we'll even get ourselves a new Xbox JRPG of our own, instead of the scraps from the PlayStation and Nintendo platforms. As for Lightning Returns, Final Fantasy XIII, it stands as a shockingly excellent and poignant conclusion to a series of games that never really managed to feel like it was terribly necessary. I really enjoyed my time with this one. I enjoyed sinking my teeth into its interlocking systems and its successful attempt at tying a neat bow on everything that 13.2 blew wide open with its absurd ending. It's just extremely my thing, and I'm greatly looking forward to someday experiencing this journey again. Isn't that the best kind of recommendation one can give? So, with the Final Fantasy XIII Trilogy finally out of the way, where do we go from here? Why, to the next long-running fantasy franchise to make its debut on the Xbox 360.